Welcome back to Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers, the podcast devoted to exploring the frontiers of psychedelic medicine and what it takes to cultivate a healthy mind, body, and spirit. As always, Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinus. I'm Dr. Steve Thayer, and today my co-host, Dr. Reid Robison, and I discuss the challenge of dealing with uncertainty. This is a challenge that we all deal with, I think, to some extent, and has been at the heart of much of my own existential dread over the years. Today, Reid and I discuss the constant and unavoidable nature of uncertainty, sources of uncertainty, what actions people tend to take to rid themselves of uncertainty, and the pros and cons of some of those actions. We'll talk about how to embrace and cope with uncertainty and much, much more. If you've ever listened to an episode of Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers and thought to yourself, I wonder where I can find good training on how to use psychedelics in a clinical practice, well, wonder no longer. Numinus has several excellent psychedelic therapy training programs. You can click on the link in the show notes or go directly to numinus.com/our-training-selection, and you can even use the code PTF10 for 10% off selected trainings. You hear Reid and I talk a lot about the psychedelic clinical trial work that Numinus does. If you or someone you know is interested in being a participant in a psychedelic clinical trial, you can click on the link in the show notes or go directly to numinus.com/research to learn more about the trials we're currently running. I know you hear me say this in every intro, but if you're feeling generous today and you'd like to support the show, you can do so by leaving us a rating or review in places like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. If you're watching on YouTube, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, share it with somebody you think might benefit from today's conversation. We would really appreciate it. Without further ado, here is today's conversation on dealing with uncertainty. Reid, I got a quote for you from a mathematician that I was unaware of until I was researching for this particular episode. But
cool. I like maths.
Yeah. This mathematics professor, John Allen Paulus, he says, uncertainty is the only certainty there is. Knowing how to live with insecurity is the only security.
Ooh, I like it.
Yeah. What do you make of that? Uncertainty is the only certainty there is.
It reminds me of the saying that change is the only constant.
Yeah, Heraclitus' river, right? That something like you can never step in the same river twice because it's not the same river and you're not the same person.
Yeah, there's truth to it, and it's I like the riddle behind it too. Makes you think. Mm-hmm. But how about I raise your quote with a poem?
I love it
for the poem learners out there, for the math verse. Mm-hmm. But this one's called "Thank You" by Ross Gray. If you find yourself half naked and barefoot in the frosty grass, hearing again the earth's great sonorous moan that says, you are the air of the now and gone, that says all you love will turn to dust and will meet you there. Do not raise your fist, do not raise your small voice against it, and do not take cover. Instead, curl your toes into the grass, watch the cloud ascending from your lips. Walk through the garden's dormant splendor. Say only thank you, thank you. Does that relate?
I think so. Well, and so what came to mind is, contemplating the perhaps sad reality that everything turns to dust, that we will all turn to dust. It sounds like I've been trying to interpret a poem on the spot. Mm-hmm. That at least, I'll say what it sort of stirred up in me was how to cope with uncertainty and the inevitability of grappling with impermanence. And that's kind of what inspired the topic today of dealing with uncertainty, grappling with uncertainty, how to live a comfortable, meaningful, purposeful life in the presence of the only certainty there is, that being uncertainty.
Yeah, and in the presence of that sobering fact that all you love will turn to dust. Mm-hmm. It's true, and it's scary, right? That everyone dies and there is change coming in one way, shape, or form at some point in pretty much everything we know, and we don't even know when that's coming.
Right. Yeah, so I think maybe we'll start there with I feel like anybody listening to this can probably relate to the struggle of dealing with, coping with, grappling with uncertainty in some way, shape, or form, right? And as you said, it can be really, really scary. And this can be uncertainty on sort of a micro level, like I'm not sure what I'm going to have for dinner this evening, or uncertainty in a relationship. I'm not sure if this relationship is going to work out. Uncertainty about the future. Am I going to be able to make more money? Like those types of uncertainties. And then macro uncertainties about our position in the universe and where do we go after we die? Or am I doing what I am called to do in this world? Questions like that have perturbed me most of my life.
Oh yeah. This is all some potent fuel for anxiety, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. And based on how we're wired, like the deck of cards we're born with, and all of our life experiences that have shaped us, we all respond differently, but we all have this common relationship with uncertainty, that it's uncomfortable. In fact, like through the ages, that's become apparent in even why religions have been formed, or why ceremonies exist, for example, because life is uncertain and uncertainty is uncomfortable. And we tend to try and condense that uncomfortable place of infinite possibilities, especially the scary ones, into something more manageable by, doing something that's more kind of ritualized, repetitive, simple, and predictable, and therefore more comfortable and safe for our system.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's something about human nature, and maybe even unique to humans among the other, animals on this planet or beings on this planet, that we want to move from uncertainty to certainty. Yeah. We're very curious creatures. And so that desire to go from sort of the insecurity or the fear of uncertainty to the security and control or perceived control of certainty has prompted the creation of the things that you mentioned, like ceremony and ritual and religion and, metaphysical beliefs, philosophy, but also the scientific method. Like I think a lot of what we enjoy in modern life in the form of technology and the development of civilization and things like that come from this insatiable curiosity that we have to make the unknown known, to make the unknowable knowable. And we've accomplished some pretty impressive things. But I think it's also responsible for an almost sort of how might I say it? Like a unquenchable thirst that leaves us always thirsty, right? We because the universe is essentially unknowable when you get down to sort of its constituent parts, and who we are in this universe. And some of you might disagree with me, but at least the way I feel about it, who we are in this universe would be difficult to me to say with authority and conviction and certainty that this is exactly the answer to that question. Yeah. It's this sort of, like I say, this unquenchable thirst at the heart of what it means to be human.
I like how you put it, because it seems to me that as civilization gets more advanced, or progresses into this like complex society we live in, more and more people have this thirst coming up. I certainly feel it in myself for more of a simple life. I think it's why you hear people say, I just want to get away from the city and live on a farm, things like that, because we do crave like the simple predictability and the security that comes with managing some of the complex, unpredictable, things we have to go through in day-to-day life, especially modern life.
Yeah. Yeah. As awesome as modern life is, it is probably a little bit more complex, if not safer for most people than we would have been on, as hunter-gatherers, where we're predominantly preoccupied with just staying alive.
Yeah, and when these rituals, I use that term loosely because it can mean just like a simple morning meditation practice, or making your bed, or brushing your teeth even, like give some sense of repetitive kind of familiarity and security that our systems find comfortable. Yeah. Gathering with family around a dinner table, for example, like a sense of security and safety in an uncertain world.
Yeah, that reminds me, I was thinking about like sources of uncertainty, and one of them is unpredictability. So when we don't know what's going to happen from day to day, that can be a very scary place to be psychologically. And so that sort of drives us to cobble together as much predictability as we can. And maybe we do that in the form of routines, and also in the form of community, where we are surrounded by people either in a family or a larger community whose behavior we can generally predict because we know them well enough. And that gives us some sense of security.
Yeah, and that reminds me of something we've talked about a lot on here, the Rebus theory, or the free energy principle, which is or the entropic brain theory, that's based on this idea that the universe is full of uncertainty, and we are wired. If you look at it from a kind of a neuroscience standpoint, we're wired as these prediction machines to deal with that in ways like the one you're describing. We're taking in data constantly, and as the unpredictability increases, so does our anxiety around the uncertainty. If we have less data, our system is less confident in predicting what's going to happen next. And those predictions become our patterns, right? In inner ones and outward ones.
Yeah, so less data leading to that anxiety. And so that's one of the ways that we strive to reduce the discomfort associated with uncertainty, is to try to get more certain. And we do that in at least one way, by accumulating more information, get more data. And you can imagine a variety of circumstances where that might apply.
Yeah. And we're doing that kind of automatically in some ways. We could talk about how that could run amok and become excessive in terms of our search for data, our search for answers. I mean, in fact, there's that Greek mythology story of Icarus flying towards the sun with wax wings. In fact, my brother Jer, who has that tattooed on himself. But it's this lesson to me anyway of giving up the incessant, excessive search to know the answers, and because much of life is unanswerable, or there is unpredictability, at the end of that search still.
Yeah, so what you're alluding to is, I think, an important balance when we're trying to grapple with uncertainty. The balance between seeking information, seeking reassurance, seeking sources of knowledge that help us predict our worlds better, balanced with surrender, right? Surrendering to perhaps the fact that we can't know everything, that there will always be uncertainty and some degree of insecurity. So back to the quote that we started with, right? That that knowing how to live with insecurity is the only security.
Yeah, you were quoting Maslow last time we spoke, I think, and I saw something from him today that said, life is an ongoing process of choosing between safety out of fear and need for defense and risk for the sake of progress and growth. Make the growth choice 12 times a day, he said. And it reminds me of this concept I quite like of in any moment we're either opening up to life, like fully feeling it, fully being present for it, or we're constricting against it because of fear, and we're closing off to life. Like take anxiety around social gatherings as an example. If it's something you value, connecting with other humans or seeing ones you love, and you would like to face that fear, if you do give into the fear instead and just do not go, make these meaningful touch points of connection that are, are near good for your heart, then you're in that place of choosing fear over love and constricting, closing off to life instead of fully being present and embracing it and living it.
Yeah. I think the example of sort of social anxiety that you might feel in anticipation of going to a social gathering is a really good one when we're talking about uncertainty. Because a lot of what causes us to suffer psychologically is I'm not sure how these people are going to perceive me. I'm not sure what they really think about me. I'm not sure how I'm going to behave in this social scenario. When we talk about people who come to us as clients with social anxiety, this is a lot of the things that vex them, right? Is not being able to know with certainty either, again, what people think about them and whether or not they like them, or how they're going to behave? Like, how am I really going to respond in this social gathering? And I sort of describe myself as an introverted extrovert, meaning I'm primarily fairly introverted, but I really like those social touch points that you're talking about.
Yeah.
But I even now as a 40-year-old man, still feel a little anxiety as I'm driving to a social event, even if it's with people I know well.
Which makes sense, and it's part of being human, right? Being human in a body means in this life where there is so much uncertainty and we don't know what the other is thinking, even the ones we love, sometimes especially the ones we love, like this shows up intensely in intimate partnerships, right? Yeah. But yeah, I think you're bringing up a good point that it's not about never feeling that fear or anxiety. That would probably lead you into this path of numbing, disconnecting,
denial.
It's about learning to be with and move through, and we can and will talk more about that. But
yeah, I mean, maybe we'll talk about it now, Reid. I think as a way of coping with uncertainty, again, back to maybe the balance comment, but opening yourself up to feeling what you're feeling, and then still behaving in a way that's in service of sort of maybe your larger values or goals that are in alignment with sort of the healthy expression of you in the world, is a way to cope with uncertainty. So in my own intimate partnership, if I feel any insecurity about, whether or not my wife likes me or wants to be around me, I can do a few things. One is I can sit with that feeling and have compassion for that feeling, knowing, as you said, that it's only very human to have a feeling, an insecure feeling like that. And then I can reference old data. I can go back to, memories of interactions with this person. How many really, really negative interactions have I had where my wife has hated me or not wanted to be around me? Almost none, right? And so I can seek reassurance that way by sort of questing back in my memory for examples of why I don't really need to be as anxious as I feel.
Yeah, isn't it funny how we fear the worst sometimes, or our mind just tends to go there? And I guess it makes sense, slipping back into that neuroscience view of how we're wired to predict and detect any potential threat, and how that can kind of go awry sometimes and be excessive. But I think life is just one big interpersonal meditation. And if you're talking about uncertainty and the response to that being to surrender and let go of excessive worrying about things you can't control, or it's relationships, especially the close ones, where I think it's the hardest practice. At least what I've seen in a lot of people, what I've experienced in me, I could think I have a bomb-ass surrender practice. And but if I had not been given the trigger opportunity to practice that kind of thing, then I wouldn't know how hard it is. I might think I'm well equipped, but this is really an embodied practice, experiential thing that's unfolding through life. And I think because of how much we love those close to us, the uncertainty and fears of rejection, abandonment, loss, all those things can be, some of the most intense.
Yeah. And, probably really, really important for our survival. Right. If we weren't well attuned to the potential sources of destruction, whether destruction was like, actual destruction to our physical body or interpersonal destruction in the form of rejection and isolation, we probably wouldn't have survived as a species.
Yeah.
So my mind returns again to balance. To grappling with uncertainty does not mean that we become certain about everything, right? That's often what's at the heart of things like OCD or generalized anxiety disorder. Is this obsession with, I need to feel certain. And so I keep seeking reassurance. I keep asking the questions like, well, what if something bad happens? How do I prevent that bad thing from happening? And then life begins to constrict around those worries, right?
Yeah. And the unfortunate paradox is that you're often triggering more of the behavior you want to avoid by the excessive attempts at reassurance or how your anxiety might manifest behaviorally in some relationships.
Right.
But what I think is important, or I like to remember on the relationship front and in general, is the ego in the face of uncertainty, wants to keep things small. And then if we're talking about like a sacred partnership or intimate relationship, it's like infinity is calling you to grow and develop, and that's the most uncertain place there is. And so we want to keep things small to keep it under our control sometimes. That's why for some people there might be a fear of intimacy or a fear of commitment or self-sabotaging before you get hurt. Yeah.
So our ego is trying to keep us small so that we're not exposed to the potential threats that infinity might expose us to. Yeah.
It's like, when we were talking about the embodied part of this uncertainty, and we're in a body and we're going to feel these feelings around, whether they're positive or negative, these experiences, and we of course want more of the joyful ones, less the negative, but they're inseparable in a way. Like we're talking about, everything eventually changes, and that dog you love so dearly will pass on one day, likely before you do, right? And that's super scary stuff. And then, but it's actually it's kind of the fuel for our awakening in a way, or the ultimate both, psycho-spiritual workout and surrender practice is to stay open in the face of that intense uncertainty, to love anyway, or to show up for life even though you don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah. It takes a lot of courage. Takes a lot of courage to love anyway, to show up anyway, in the presence of the fear that uncertainty often causes.
Especially with past hurt too, in the relationship department, that's what often shapes people's fear of abandonment, fear of rejection, is from getting rejected or abandoned in the past.
Right.
Yeah. And, we talk a lot about inner child work, of course, but just from a big picture standpoint, doesn't matter if it was last year or when you were 5 years old, those things matter.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe there's some self-compassion that needs to happen here, as dear listener, you're on your own quest to figure out how you're going to grapple with the fears of uncertainty and insecurity. Like Reid said earlier, just to know that this is part of what it means to be human, and that depending on what's happened to you in your life, and combined with the particular genetic code that you came into the world with, that it might be more or less difficult for you. Regardless, a nice helping of self-compassion is rarely a bad idea.
Yeah. It's always, that's one of those things that's always a good idea, self-compassion. But do you want to hear a summary of Ram Dass's take on uncertainty? I think it applies to
it's hard to say no to a Ram Dass summary.
Hard to say no. So I heard this talk from him once, not in real life. It was a recording because it was a long time ago. But
you're not that old.
But where he was talking about how even the great saints, enlightened gurus, they're all as neurotic as anybody else. He likes to point this out, which I find helpful. And people are like, what do you mean? And he says that the neurosis is a human embodied default world kind of thing. He didn't use those words. But at their stage of psycho-spiritual development, as like a great saint, for example, it becomes less relevant. And what he means is that you don't have to stop having neuroses. You don't have to eradicate them. They, in fact, will come up. And by neuroses, he's just talking about these anxieties around uncertainty that we all have. You just need to stop identifying with them and make friends with them. And he said, and they come for tea. I want to pause there for a sec, because I think that's the most useful metaphor ever, is to have tea with your uncertainties and your fears, right? But then he says, how do people respond to this? Like, number one would be check out distract, like go buy some more stuff, get more immediate pleasure because it feels good. They essentially go for a dopamine spike, right? You might check out, get high, go drink a bunch of alcohol or whatever it may be, another hit of dopamine, or another way of numbing, distracting busyness, for example. And we could talk more about that. But the other category I thought was really interesting that he talks about is there's another alternative to reduce the fear, is if you align yourself with what you perceive as quote unquote good or quote unquote evil. In other words, it's in the world of good and evil, and you're part of either the elect or the good guys or the bad guys, and you push away the bad guys, thinking that that'll then protect you from the uncertainty of the evil in the world. But it's a pretty black and white view to see it that way, because we, of course, don't know the subtle nuances of someone's perspective and other, culture, community group they're a part of or belief system. So the people, we as humans tend to grab onto belief systems thinking that it'll make us feel less anxious around the uncertainty. And we try to convince others that this is the right way or they're in the wrong. And then we get this polarized world, which leads to, what we're seeing a lot of these days. Ours is the only way. If you don't do it this way, it's missing, it's wrong. And so what he says, and this is what made me think of it, because you just brought up self-compassion. He's like, you have to have a lot of compassion, not just self, but extended to the other as well, for the stages that people are in. And he goes on to point out how the souls are not good or evil. People's actions, people's intentions, motivations, even their temperament, disposition, action, tendency, personality, leaning, this thing of this good or evil thing. It's not about their soul. It's about their karma they've got to work out in a way, but it can be unbearable to watch the suffering that one person in a certain stage can spread or bring onto others. And it can get pretty dark. And that's what he calls like the smile of unbearable compassion. But he says that's the predicament we're in. But the minute you identify with those acts as the person, you're kind of locked into that state of thinking, and you're seeing the roles and not the souls, if you will. So the art, he says, and then I'll wind down my recap. The art is to not identify with that, to see the souls and not roles, to see the actions as evil, but the real human, both in others and in ourselves, and to not identify with the anxiety, but just to let it come and go like clouds in the sky. Yeah.
Wow. There's a lot to react to in that. One of the things that was really important for me in my own development. We talked a lot about adult development in a recent episode that people really liked.
Fun.
But was noticing what he said about gurus, that there is no one out there who has it all figured out. Because one of the ways I tried to deal with my own uncertainty growing up, especially as a young college student, was to kind of guru chase. Yeah. And basically I was looking for people who knew the things I didn't know.
Who were perfect.
Yeah. But just like looking for mentors who had it all figured out. Whether that be actual mentors I had in my real life, or mentors by proxy by reading their books, listening to their podcasts, because I was just convinced that if I found the right person or the right community, the right collection of persons, then I would know capital T truth, and then I wouldn't have to feel uncertain about a lot of these things that sort of vexed me or plagued me. And so when I finally discovered or learned that nobody has it all figured out, that even the enlightened gurus are also neurotic, at first it was a crisis. It was like, oh no, nobody has it figured out. And I sort of had this existential crisis. But then after a lot of help from others and a lot of contemplation and therapy and things like that, that became actually a source of comfort for me. that nobody has it all figured out. So the pressure to have it all figured out suddenly was relaxed. And then it has since then become a lot easier for me to just be me, and for that to be an art project, as opposed to like a science experiment that I had to discover the truth of.
Yeah, this does sound like some of the stuff we were talking about last time, or when we talked about adult development and kind of that existential crisis or awakening, when you realize that there wasn't that perfect human devoid of all fear out there, or negative feelings to deal with.
Yeah, or that had all the answers, right? That could help me avoid those negative feelings. And that maybe if there are answers, they're the ones we're talking about, like the ones of surrendering.
The only way out is through.
Indeed.
Yeah.
The only way out is through. There was a quote from a quantum physicist that actually gave me a lot of comfort. If you think you know what's going on in the reality of the world, just, talk to a quantum physicist and they will disabuse you of that confidence. But this comes from Sean Carroll, who says, quantum mechanics says that what the world is different than what we see when we look at it. So, you want to be certain about a thing, and you use all the tools of empiricism or inductive reasoning or whatever, intuition, to look at your world. But to be told that what you see isn't actually what the world is kind of terrifying. Wait a second, I'm measuring it. I'm using all the tools and strategies I have to get certain about a thing. But this quantum physicist is telling me that it's not what I see when I look at it. We were joking about how we were joking around earlier before we hit record. How can we work in the Heisenberg uncertainty principle?
Just did.
But I think I just did, right?
Yeah. Heisenberg, what was his name? Werner
Heisenberg.
Yeah, Nobel Prize in physics. And what you said about measuring things is part of it, like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. I've been pondering just for fun earlier today to see how it might relate to kind of some of these spiritual philosophical views. But it's a fun but deep rabbit hole to go down. But besides his thing about, you can never know the exact position and speed of a particle, because they all have wave-like properties. He also, part of it was that the act of observing or measuring something has an effect on it. Yeah.
Yeah, and so when you back away from quantum physics and you look at sort of just regular old science, we're trying to, with either fancy statistical tools or really, really good scientific experiment design, control for all the noise, right? We're trying to eliminate all the confounding variables so that what we see is exactly what we're testing for. But there's actually no way to control for all the noise, especially when you're doing psych research. I mean, our p-values are embarrassingly low.
Yeah, and from even backing up, although I want to stay in the quantum realm because it's fun. But from a neuroscience standpoint, we really literally do not see things the same as each other, right? Like what is entering my visual field in the form of these energy particles and light waves coming in and hitting the rods and cones on the back of my retina are landing on this optic nerve that is mine and different from yours because of my DNA and because of how I've been shaped from my life experiences. And then when it's projected through these other pathways onto my brain, I am seeing a different scene than you while you're looking at that same scene. Not to mention how it's going to be different for you tomorrow and different for me the next day as well.
Yeah, this idea that reality is relative to perspective is bizarre. I've also heard it described as the parallax problem. So if I'm looking at an old speedometer that's just sort of a dial, a line over the printed numbers on the back, and if I'm looking at it from one perspective, I might say the speedometer says that I'm going 80 miles an hour. But if you're in the passenger seat and looking at it from an angle, you're seeing that dial, that little finger, whatever, that line, hovering over a different tick on the printed numbers. So from your perspective, the speedometer is saying something different, and we'd have to verify with outside measures. Anyway, this idea that truth is relative can be really, really perplexing and anxiety provoking for those of us that just want reality to be a certain way.
Yeah, but I like that old speedometer metaphor, because it's like we were talking about in the adult development chat about how just the more perspectives you can put yourself in, whether you're literally like traveling the world, you're astral projecting to someone else's viewpoint of a situation and taking that in. So it's not just your one biased view.
Mm-hmm.
The more perspectives you get, the more of a complete view of that relative truth you get.
It makes me think of your polarization point, because a lot of times what causes conflict are people who are unwilling or unable to take the other person's perspective.
Yeah.
Right? They are convinced of their perspective, and they think you should have their perspective, which creates conflict.
And that would be like, I think the Ram Dass example is kind of more of a Hindu view of uncertainty and surrender, and overlapping a lot with the Buddhist view. But I think the Buddhist viewpoint would view it more stemming from the illusion of separation, like illusion being a fitting term with what we're talking about, of not seeing things the same. And, whether it's a relationship conflict or a full-on war, it's not hard to see that illusion of separation being at the root of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And might I also point out, I think this is one of the reasons why psychedelics have a lot of potential as a therapeutic tool, but also why a lot of people, the real psychedelic enthusiasts, are hoping that it will raise the collective consciousness of humanity, because it's sort of this induction into perspective, because of the things it does neurologically and, calming, that with reference to your, with the Rebus model, right? Relaxed beliefs under psychedelics.
Yeah, in the same way that a meditation practice over time could make you less caught up in the illusion of separation, right? Or less likely to harm other humans or the planet, because you're more fully present and attuned to the impact, the wave-like ripple effects of your actions, and you're more kind of open to those effects of what it might do. You have the other people more in your heart with this expanded perspective.
Yeah, I mean, we can't overstate how important perspective taking is when grappling with uncertainty in all these different contexts we're talking about. I mean, I'm thinking of sort of the standard approach to a couple that comes in for couples counseling who are having communication issues and they're really not aligned. One of the first things a couples counselor might do is to help them communicate differently in a way that enables them to take each other's perspective, to have more compassion and empathy. And you engage in this sort of very predictable conversation style. Where first I will listen to you. And then before I say what I want to say, I'm going to make sure I understood your perspective correctly by, mirroring and repeating back to you in my own words what I think I heard you say. And that can go a long way. It's rarely, the final tool, but
it's huge. Yeah. And that's what I find myself doing as an antidote to uncertainty and the discomfort related to it a lot lately, is just perspective realignment. Because if I find myself caught up in overthinking and worrying about something, it's very likely that what I need to do is, in whatever way works for me, a lot of ways to get there, a lot of paths up this mountain, but like retreat from that limited perspective place and find a way to regain perspective, to slip back into that other place. Well, I think there are a couple layers of it. First, you're slipping back into the witness consciousness, or you're disidentifying with the thought, the fear, the uncertainty itself, and the discomfort associated with it. And then you can slip even bigger back into this more spiritual surrender, into the, like surrendering your will to the divine. It's hard to put in words that are kind of universally accepted when you're talking about some spiritual concepts, but like what Jesus said of, thy will, not mine, be done, or what some of the kind of Eastern philosophies would just say, letting that shit go.
Right. That's a direct quote.
Yeah.
So it's making me wonder other tools or strategies or perspectives people might use or take on to help them grapple with uncertainty. And I think a what we might call a spiritual or religious belief system helps a lot of people. Like when you can take everything that you don't understand or that you feel uncertain about and let go and let God, that can be really, really comforting for a lot of people. Like, I don't have to know all the things, because what I do know, back when I was younger and I would hear from the pulpit people say, I know beyond a shadow of a doubt, or with every fiber of my being. Those were phrases that I often heard. That God sort of has my back, then that can be incredibly comforting and relieve us of a lot of this anxiety that comes with being uncertain.
Yeah. Yeah. And that is an example of what we were talking about, of how we are inclined as humans to seek out these ways of kind of punctuating life's mystery with something more comforting and predictable and secure. And those ceremonies, rituals, practices, gatherings, and things we do aren't always pleasant. It shows how this isn't just a simple matter of uncomfortable or not. There's a big perspective question in here, and a big meaning question too, because if you look at why people do sweat lodges, or we've talked about like intense yoga practices, or extended duration drum circles, like people are exerting a lot of effort, and sometimes they're like a sweat lodge. Sometimes that's extremely uncomfortable on the body, but done to kind of sacramentalize the discomfort and the mystery into something that's more meaningful and makes more sense.
Yeah, and often done in community.
Yeah, yeah. So what else to do about it? I think the big thing is surrender, and I like to break surrender down into a few different stages, phases, parts. Like, first of all, there's this outward fight against life, like your actions. Like if there's a situation out of your control that you're caught up in, and then you start to realize, oh no, this is counterproductive for me to be expending all this energy fighting, road raging, suing, whatever it is. Having a marathon argument day after day with a loved one. You let go of that, first of all, like the actions around it, the fight. And then there's what we were just talking about, like slipping into that less identified place of seeing I am not my thoughts, my feelings, my fears, and that kind of slightly more expanded perspective. And then what we're talking about in the spiritual context. And so how does one do that? There are a myriad of ways, right?
Yeah, I like that. It's maybe a mindfulness approach to dealing with uncertainty. I'm thinking of dealing with the cognitions directly. You could do what sort of the CBT folks might call play the tape forward. So let's say you're plagued by what if worries. What if something bad happens? What if this happens? Like, what if I take this job or what if I don't take this job? And we can get really stuck at that level of what if. So sometimes what is helpful is to just play the tape forward. Well, I've got this speech I need to give. What if I flub or fumble? Okay, well, what if you do? What might happen? Well, then people might laugh at me. Okay, what if that happens? Well, then I'm going to feel embarrassed. What might happen after that? Well, then maybe I'll lose my job. Okay, what would happen after that? And you just keep playing that tape forward until you get to the worst case scenario. And it's often the case that the worst case scenario at the end of that train is, although undesirable, not unmanageable. Like it wouldn't be the end of the world necessarily. Yeah. So if you can meditate on that and grapple with the worst case scenario, all of a sudden what is likely to happen, which is, 50 things removed from the worst case scenario is all of a sudden more tolerable. So it's a way of getting some certainty in there in the midst of the uncertainty.
I like that. I like it. And it reminds me of how in some of these other schools of thought, like Eastern philosophies, religious traditions, spiritual systems, they have a practice sometimes of meditating on death and like which we tend to fear and avoid and avert our gaze from around here. Whereas in India, you'll see more ceremonies around it, like bodies being kind of put in the Ganges River, for example, or they're spending more time meditating on that, and I think less afraid of it. And in our culture, in the U.S. anyway, I think that our fear of death has more of a grasp or grip on us than we realize, and that becomes evident when people have a serious illness or come, or near death kind of wake up call, for example, or it can be striking how the body reacts to that, how anxious and fearful, understandably it is, but that practice of not averting our gaze to it and taking that in as a reality of life can help settle the nervous system in pretty far-reaching ways.
Yeah, I mean, the old existentialists would say that fear of death is one of sort of the primary preoccupations that human beings have, and that if we push it out of awareness into the subconscious mind or the unconscious mind, it's responsible for a lot of our neuroses. And so to grapple with the reality of death can be a healthy exercise. So whether it's regardless of whether or not it is popular in our American culture, I think it's an important thing to grapple with. And like I said, a lot of people will grapple with it in accordance with their religious belief system, and they find comfort there.
Yeah.
I've also played around with optimistic nihilism, or maybe absurdism. This idea.
Absurdism is fun.
Yeah. If just Google absurdism and then go watch the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once, and because it's a wonderful creative take on dealing with existential absurdism.
Yeah.
And if you can set up shop there, it can be really, really comforting. Just again, absurdism meaning the idea that the universe is unknowable, it's weird, it's absurd that any of us are even conscious. So let's enjoy it. And when it's not enjoyable, let's enjoy that too. It's an interesting meditative approach.
Yeah,
about
I love
uncertainty. Yeah, and the optimistic nihilist is everything ends in dust. In a couple hundred years, everyone you have known and that has known you is going to be gone. You put sort of the things that you're worried about in a cosmic eternal perspective, all of a sudden they don't carry as much weight.
Like Carl Sagan's Pale Blue Dot.
Pale Blue Dot.
Yeah, it's such a beautiful meditation on our tiny place in the universe.
I'm also reminded of, and this, I guess, is related to what we were talking earlier with Ram Dass, but Kristen Neff's work on radical acceptance.
Tara Brach.
I think, didn't Kristen Neff write a book?
Tara Brach wrote, it's right up there over your shoulder, Radical Acceptance. But Kristen Neff is the self-compassion writer.
Self-compassion.
Guru. Yeah. But maybe they're friends. Maybe they collaborate.
No, now you're going to make me Google here.
Ooh, do it.
Anyway, but the principle, I think, is it's not the same as being resigned or resignation, but to accept what you can and can't control and preoccupy yourself with the things that you can.
Yeah, that reminds me of a concept also from the yoga philosophy world of, at some point on your journey, the saying in the Yoga Sutras is the seeker becomes the seer. And, you could interpret that a lot of ways, but it's kind of like the Icarus story of eventually you let go of the need for the answers and you kind of become one with that path and just accept that, like we talk about a lot on here, we're all in this beautiful hot mess, an absurd one at times, together, and walking each other home, as Ram Dass would say, and you just kind of let go of some of the excessive suffering that we bring on, like our emotional reaction to the pain, to the uncertainty, by like slipping back into that being state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, Reid, I think this has been a delightful and tangential as our conversations about topics like this tend
all
to be.
Over the universe.
Any other final thoughts about grappling with uncertainty?
No, just maybe a final word on surrender, because the term, I think pre-psychedelic therapy, intention setting, and everything else was more often conjured up for more people this negative thing of giving up, giving in, defeat. But the way we talk about it here, and I think this is a given for many or most, but the way we talk about it isn't a stance of weakness. It's actually one of the greatest feats of strength, in my opinion, you can practice. And it's letting go of your resistance, if you will, with total openness of who you are, giving up the tension of that little vortex you feel caught up in and identified with at times, and realizing kind of the depths of this kind of ocean of existence and power and beauty that is in your being, and how you can open up without holding back to life, in spite of it, even with feeling the fear of uncertainty.
Well said.
Well, always a pleasure, Steve.
Always. Thank you. Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinus, a mental wellness company committed to tackling the global mental health crisis by delivering best-in-class psychedelic-assisted therapies, contributing to the body of primary and clinical psychedelic research, and fostering healing through community connection and social responsibility. You can learn more about Numinus at numinus.com. That's Numinus.com. If you enjoyed the show today and you want to support us, here's how you do it. Rate and review the show on platforms like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Subscribe to the Numinus YouTube channel, like the videos, and share it. Share the show or clips of the show with someone that you think will enjoy it. The content of this podcast does not constitute medical advice or mental health treatment. Consult with a medical or mental health professional if you believe you are in need of mental health treatment.